Thank you all for being here. I'm Carrie Messel. I'm Chair of Management and Marketing in the School of Business, and I am absolutely delighted to get to be a part of this program sponsored by the LCWA. Thank you all for being here. Pretty quickly this morning, Marshall Goldsmith and I discovered that we are both first-generation college students from Kentucky. And as a first-generation college student from a rural part of the U.S., I am absolutely delighted to have you in this room providing this opportunity for our students. One of the things that I found really exciting about this program is that a few weeks ago, I was lucky enough to be on a phone call with Dean Tim Johnson, and in that call was exposed to this program and recognized something that I think is really unique and was the first time that I've ever seen what I'm about to say before. On this program together, there are breakout sessions that bring students from different programs on campus together. Some of those students are Bonner leaders, global ambassadors, international scholars, Perlmutter fellows, Shotland scholars, Martin scholars, and market process scholars. I had the opportunity to found Shotland Scholars about 12 years ago now. I can't think of ever seeing these groups together on a program before. Thank you for providing that format. With no further ado, I've been given the opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Dr. John Izzo. Dr. John Izzo is a coach and friend, or was a coach and friend of John Mroz, and over the past 20 years, he has spoken to more than 1 million people, taught at 3 major universities, advised more than 500 organizations, and been featured in various media organizations. But what I think is really exciting and interesting is that he has been provided counsel on activating purpose to some of the most successful companies and companies that we all know, like McDonald's, SAPA, RBC, Lockheed Martin, Manulife, DuPont, Humana, Microsoft, and the Mayo Clinic. With no further ado, thank you for being here.
So first of all, let me add my good morning and congratulations to the College of Charleston for starting this Global Leadership Institute to extend the memory and work of my dear friend John Mroz. And Karen, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. How many of you knew John? I'm just curious. I'm personally good. So those of you who didn't know John, I just want to take a moment before I talk about the theme of my talk today around regenerative leadership, just to honor the man for just a moment. I met John probably later in his life than some of you did, but we became fast friends. And in the time that we had together, I think really formed a pretty deep bond. And what struck me most about John was that he had a big heart and a powerful mind. He had a strong commitment to what he wanted to do in the world, and he acted on that and brought it to life from when he was a young man. I have to tell you, over the last 30 days with what's been happening with Ukraine and Russia, I would sleep better at night if John were still in the game. And John could be tough too, I remember going to an Interpol meeting with him at The Hague, and I happened to wear like a pink shirt. And he said, Izzo, he said, that may work in the consulting world. You wear white when you're here. John, I am wearing white this morning, I want you to know. And if you give me just a moment of personal indulgence, about 2 years after John died, I walked for the first of now has been a couple of times the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain. Beautiful pilgrimage taken by people of all kind of walks and faiths now. And in my middle of my 33-day walk, I was on a high mountain pass just before dawn, walking by myself, and I invited John to walk with me. And I wrote this poem, and I just share it with you, really without comment. I asked you to walk with me this morning as I walked a high mountain pass above the clouds, the sun rising behind my back. I knew you'd have loved this place with thousands of pilgrims from all over the world walking with one purpose, to find again the meaning in life and to live more deeply into the world as you had done. How all these different languages had come together to walk this one path, lending hands to each other regardless of where they had come from. And as I walked a path of 1,000 stones, I knew that if you were walking with me, that in every place we stayed, you would be the one that people loved the most, and that every person would be sure that you had liked them best. You had that gift. And I told you now what I couldn't tell you then, that you were the kind of father I wish I had had, deep and strong, humble yet powerful, but most of all, able to hear above all the noise, the whisper of God. And I remembered how you'd said if there was a way to speak from the other side, you'd find a way. Then how in the robin's red breast you had visited those you loved. And just then, a wind blew in the still morning, rustling the trees, right beside where you walked with me. And on we walked in silence. John, you're still with us. So my theme this morning, regenerative leadership. How much must leadership change to create a sustainable future? And I really don't feel like I come with the answer today. I want to hopefully provoke some questions about what kind of leadership might in fact be regenerative leadership. And what I mean by regenerative leadership is pretty simple. Leadership that enhances the capacity for thriving now and in the future for people, society, and planet. And by default, we could say degenerative leadership is leadership that diminishes the capacity for thriving now, for people, meaning individuals, society, and planet. And I want to be suggestive of how leadership must change if we're to create a more sustainable future. And I can't help but think of the irony, the serendipity, the tragedy in a way that we're having this, when we planned this gathering a year ago, that what would be happening in the world would be such a poignant reminder of how important the work that we're talking about is. So while I won't focus on that today, I will perhaps say a few words about what I think regenerative leadership might mean, even in this very moment that we're in. Now, I think the first thing, if we're going to talk about regenerative leadership, I call, Jim Collins' often quoted, widely read, often criticized book, Good to Great. People say he oversimplified the world. Most great books do oversimplify the world. The worst books overcomplicate the world. Authors forget that. But one of the things I love is that, he had, the first thing he said, if you want to go from good to great, is you have to face the brutal facts. And I think the first thing we have to face is the brutal fact that we have not created a regenerative future. And our leadership has been mostly degenerative. Now later I'll tell you why I'm hopeful about the future, but we have to face the facts. My friend Otto Scharmer at MIT, some of you may know his work, Theory U. I think he's one of the really most beautiful spokespersons of our time of what's happening in the world and also what we have to do to portage to a different place. And Otto talks about the three divides of modern society, which to me are kind of emblematic of the degenerative leadership and what we've created. The first divide is the eco divide. That's not a surprise to any of us in this room. When I travel all over the world and I ask audiences, young or old, raise your hand if you think the path we're on in our relationship with the earth is sustainable for our generation and next generations. Almost no one raises their hand. We all know that almost every, in fact, my biologist friends tell me literally every ecosystem of the earth, from the soil to the atmosphere to the oceans, are literally at or on the brink of collapse. So the eco divide, the unsustainable degenerative relationship we have with Earth. Second, Otto talks about the self divide, which is the people-to-people divide. And you could cut that many ways, the accumulation of wealth by a very few, while often public infrastructure around the world deteriorates and the poor get poorer, although it's kind of only half the story because more people are in the middle class now also than any time in human history. But also the self to self could be nation against nation, way of thinking about the world. Think about even now, as some of us thought was behind us now, the divide that we see with China and India and Russia, not putting them all in the same camp because they're not, but kind of saying that we don't see the world the way you see it. And I'm not wise enough to know who's right. I suspect no one is actually right. But the point is we have a divide between the self and the self. And finally, what he calls the spiritual divide, which is the loss of meaning and purpose across the world. For the first time in modern human history, it's maybe a good news, bad news story, more people have died from suicide in the last decade than have died in wars. So we have a crisis, a spiritual crisis of meaning as well. And I would add to that the political divide, which is the inability of either authoritarian societies or democratic societies to create in their own nations a regenerative future. So enough of the bad news. Where do we go from here? But we have to face the facts. There's hope, but if stay on the path we're on right now, we're in trouble. Now I want to talk about 5 things that I believe represent regenerative leadership. The first thing is regenerative leadership must by its nature be cross-generational leadership. You must be willing to do the hard things now that are required for thriving in the future. One of the companies I've had the privilege of working with is Seventh Generation. Some of you may know them, a great cleaning products company, later bought by Unilever. Their name came from an Iroquois, ancient, about 1,000-year-old principle from the Iroquois people here in North America, that decisions that are made by communities and by leaders should take into account what will make life better for the next 7 generations. And, depending on how you define that, could be anywhere from 200 to 400 years. You might ask yourself, how many decisions do we make right now in our society, in businesses or in government, that we're thinking in those terms? Most CEOs in America are rewarded primarily for short-term profits. If you doubt that for a moment, think about what happens to almost every stock of a large company on the day they acquire another company. The company they acquired goes up in price, and theirs almost always 90% of the time goes down, even though in almost every case they have just made a decision that in a cross-generational perspective is for the good of the shareholders. But the CEOs are often punished in the short term for doing the right thing. It isn't true anymore, but at one time in Japan, CEOs were bonused on how the company performed 10 years after they left their office. Now imagine how you might act differently if you were rewarded for how the company performed after you left instead of while you were there. Warren Buffett once said, it's one of my favorite quotes, he said, in the short term, the stock market is a voting machine, but in the long term, it is a weighing machine. So in the short term, it's just whatever's in the news this morning. In the long term, it's a scale of weight of what value that company has added or not added to society. I would suggest history is also a weighing scale rather than a voting machine. What seems wise in the short run may in fact wind up making you incredibly unpopular or even considered a poor leader in retrospect. And it takes courage to lead cross-generationally. Tony Blair was once asked why it was so hard to tackle climate change, which almost every thinking person knows is, probably top of the biggest challenge that we face as humanity, though we've got a hell of a lot of them. And he said the primary reason is because the costs of acting happen while you are in office and before the next election, while the costs of not acting happen after you leave office. So that'll get to something else I'm going to talk about later, which is we have a system problem, but we have to first recognize that if we're going to have regenerative leadership, we must be thinking cross-generationally. And while there's lots of things I don't like about China, not as the people of China, but the way China is run and governed, I will say that the Chinese have a 50 and a 75-year plan. There is no 50 or 70-year, 5-year plan in any, major democracy in the world. You go to China, you realize that the Wall of China was built over 1,000 years as a public works project, okay, with slaves mostly, to both protect them from the invaders from the north and to create a trade route. Try to find one example of a cross-generational, other than building a cathedral, a cross-generational works project in the Western world, and you would have a hard time finding one. So first we have to think cross-generationally. And by the way, just to make that real right now, I have certainly been impressed how the leaders of NATO and President Biden have, even though there's all this popular hue and cry for a no-fly zone, I'm glad they're thinking cross-generationally. They're thinking, you know, as painful as what's happening in Ukraine is right now, that an escalation of the war would actually have perhaps consequences for generations yet to come. So sometimes leading cross-generationally means we won't be popular right now. The second thing is, if we're going to lead cross-generationally, we must have a system focus. Many of you know of Peter Senge's work, The Fifth Discipline. He popularized an idea he didn't create called systems thinking. I love what Peter says about a system problem. How do you know you have a system problem? It's because the outcome the system has created is not what most of the individuals in the system would choose. So again, let's take the environment as an example. You know, if I took a vote right now, you know, all over the world, how many of you would like to have an unsustainable relationship with the future? Damn your children and grandchildren to droughts and famines. You know, no one would vote for that. And yet that's the path that we're on. And so regenerative leaders always need to ask, what is it about the system that must change if we're going to have regeneration? And I'll give you some examples of how we have to think. Let's take ecology as a good example. We've currently built a system where people can't have livelihood if they don't make things with planned obsolescence and feed a consumer culture to buy things we rarely and often never use. And you say, well, that's just the way it is. You can't have an economy if we don't make billions of things we don't need. And I beg to differ. We've simply created a system, a human-created system, in which the only way people can thrive is to create more things that destroy the planet. Another example, how do we measure our economic success? GDP. I have my own acronym for GDP, Gross Destructive Product. You see, think of all that, nothing wrong with GDP, but all it really measures is how much goods we produce and use. It's a blunt instrument to measure the success of a society, and yet it's routinely how we measure whether we're making progress. We need to ask, is that the only or the right way? And as you know, some countries have started to measure happiness as a way of thinking that. How about healthy democracy? Is healthy democracy a system problem? I think so. Thomas Jefferson said democracy depended almost entirely on an educated, informed public. He knew that if the public didn't know what was going on, if they didn't know the facts, if they didn't take the time to understand the facts, democracy would be in trouble. And we know that information is at the heart of a regenerative society because, again, going back to Peter Senge's point, since most humans would choose the right thing knowing the same facts, that's how we lead to regeneration. I had the privilege, just as an aside, years ago to be involved with Harley-Davidson when they were on the brink of bankruptcy. Remember, they were about to go out of business. Their quality was horrible. Their union relationships were horrible. And, the former executives came back, rebought the company, said, let's see if we can save this thing. And save it they did. One of the first things they did, even though they were running out of money, or almost had already run out of money, was they put every single employee through a series of full-day sessions where they totally opened up the books. This is what it looks like from our side of the table, the people running the show. Here's how we compare with our competitors. Here's our financial positions. Here's how our salaries compare, our work rules with others. And then they ask those thousands of employees in their one-day sessions, if you were us, what would you do? And given the same facts that the leaders had, the employees pretty much said, well, we better get our act together, we better work a little harder, we better get better quality, we better learn from others. We certainly can't stay on the path we are, and the rest is history. Information is at the lifeblood of a healthy governance, healthy regeneration, whether it's in a company or in a society. And we have different problems, by the way, in authoritarian societies, as we see now in Russia, is the way you keep people from making regenerative decisions is you hide the truth from them. You create a alternative view of what's happening. And that's how you keep people on side with you. In democracies, we have the opposite problem. We have too much information. You see, in authoritarian societies, only one form of information is seen as true. In our current democratic societies, every piece of information is seen as true, which is equally dangerous. There is no, in fact, arbiter of truth. You doubt that for a moment? Think about a few things. When all information is treated equal, then people can believe that vaccines are more dangerous than a pandemic disease. When all information is believed, people can routinely believe what almost no expert believes, that elections were stolen through fraud. And even now, the Washington Post did a fascinating piece just a few days ago about the war in Ukraine. And one of the things they talked about was that by having selective coverage, the one Russian tank being blown up, you probably saw that image on television, and the Russian soldier running into the woods, it gives the impression to the average person that Ukraine is winning the war, which only feeds people's desire to help them more militarily. Let's help them win the war, when in fact, if you follow all the news, you know day by day the Russians are tragically, inhumanely grinding down the Ukrainian people. By the way, I'm not saying what we should do about it. That's not my field of expertise. The point I'm making is you see why information is so important and why we must understand the system itself. I think of Dwight Eisenhower. You remember I talk about history as a weighing machine? He's a great example. When Eisenhower left the presidency, he was called Do-Nothing Ike. Historians at the time said he would be known as pretty much an average president at best. In 2017, when historians were polled to rank the presidents, anyone want to guess where Eisenhower stood? 5th. From Do-Nothing Ike to the 5th. Because in retrospect, people realized that Eisenhower had done all kinds of interesting things. He ended the Korean War, and for the next 7.5 years, in one of the most dangerous times in modern history, the United States was not involved in another conflict. While he didn't end Soviet-U.S. enmity, he didn't increase it. And in one of the most powerful farewell addresses a president has ever, most farewell addresses from presidents are thanking their brother and thanking their mother, and it's been great, and now I'm going to go write some books. Well, I'm being a little silly, right? Eisenhower, you can watch it sometime. And he gave that famous warning about the military-industrial complex. And what he really was saying was that if we're not careful, the alliance of powerful interests will get the society a systemic problem, to spend money on things we shouldn't necessarily spend money on, to make decisions we shouldn't spend money on. And ironically, go back and watch it, he warned specifically about a generation using the resources of the future to the detriment of those who are yet to come. Now, the third thing is, if we want regenerative leadership, we have to talk about the word legacy. I do a lot of coaching of CEOs, mostly in my work. And one of the most powerful questions I like to ask CEOs is this simple question: what do you want to be remembered for? And I ask that question for a very specific reason, because I have found it's the only question that when I ask it, they think beyond the next couple of years. When I ask that question, they start imagining they're no longer the CEO. They're an old man or an old woman sitting on a porch looking back on their life, wondering what they were remembered for. I think of Dolph Vandenbrink, a friend of mine, when he took over Heineken Mexico, which is, by the way, the largest Heineken company in the world, all kinds of great beers like Tecate, and he wanted to reimagine the purpose of Heineken Mexico. And so he took his team on a retreat. And that's one of the questions that he asked them is, what do you want to be remembered for personally? And by the way, he began there because if you get someone to ask first, what do you want to be remembered for in your personal life? Almost no one says, I had a big bank account, I drove a Porsche. They say, I want my grandchildren to love me. I want to be remembered I was like a good citizen and I mentored people and all of that. And by the time they left the series of retreats, they didn't have a new purpose, which was to sell more beer, though that was in there too. They said, to win big for a better Mexico. They said, we want in the time that we are leaders to be remembered Heineken had an impact on a society with so much potential, but some key things holding it back. And they said one of those things is domestic violence, where 70% of Mexican women have experienced domestic violence in any 3-year period. And the beer brand that had the girly calendar on the walls of mechanic shops in Mexico, Tecate, not only stopped doing the calendar, but took on domestic violence, even to the point of running ads in Mexico saying, if you do domestic violence or you support it or you don't speak up about it, we don't want you. Don't buy our beer. And then they did it in many serious ways as well. That's what happens when we ask legacy questions. Morena Hernandez at the University of Virginia, just kind of up the road here a piece, has done some fascinating research on what motivates leaders to do what she calls stewardship behavior, which is behavior that, is beyond the immediate but has an impact on a regenerative future. And the interesting thing is altruism, it turns out, is not all that strong a motivator of people having stewardship behavior. So if you say, look, it's the right thing to do, it's the moral thing, it's what the Bible, it's what the Quran teaches us, it's not the strongest motivator of stewardship behavior. It turns out the strongest motivator is legacy. When people think about what they want to be remembered for, that's when they get hooked in. Marshall, my friend, who's if you haven't seen Marshall, he's fun. He's a rogue, he's a nut, and he's fun. And Marshall was telling me one time, just as a funny aside, shows how legacy thinking works, that he was coaching a CEO, and he does this feedback system where they get 360 feedback, and pretty much they all said, look, he's smart, but he's a jerk. He's an absolute jerk. He doesn't care about people's feelings. It's like nobody likes him, but he's smart. So Marshall gave the guy the feedback. He said, well, it's not true. And he said, that's what they said. He said, well, it's not true. Well, if it is true, it's only true at work. It's not true in my personal life. He said, well, is your wife home? And he said, yes. He said, can we call her? He said, sure. So Marshall gets his wife on the speakerphone. The feedback is he's smart, but he's a jerk, doesn't care about if he finishes people's sentences, all of this. He says it's true at work, but not in the... Now, she cracks up laughing. She said, of course he's a jerk. I know he's a jerk. His friends know he's a jerk. His parents know he's a jerk. His kids know the kids know he's a jerk, but we love him anyway. So he hangs up the phone. And then he says this to Marshall. I can handle the people at work thinking I'm a jerk. But the idea of my children having to apologize to my grandchildren for what a jerk their grandfather is, I don't want to be remembered for that. Now, I was thinking in these last few days, if I were in the close circle of Vladimir Putin, I tried to imagine for a moment if he actually has anyone who talks to him in any thoughtful way. Most people do, even the most crazy leaders often have someone who's got their ear. And I was wondering if I had a chance to talk to him if I was a confidant, a coach, before he invaded the Ukraine. I think this is what I would... By the way, I have no idea if it would have worked. I would like if someone had taken a crack at it. This is what I would have said. At one time you were incredibly popular in Russia. They felt diminished by the the West after the fall of the Berlin Wall, dismissed as a two-bit, forgotten empire. And they loved that you were strong in standing up for Russia. And you know what? You're not as popular as you used to be, maybe, but a lot of Russians still love you. Things are better than they used to be. If you invade Ukraine, one day there will be statues in Moscow of Zelensky, and you will eventually only be in a museum. And I'm wondering if that's what you want to be remembered for. I don't know if it would have worked, but it probably had a better chance than talking to him about how a lot of Ukrainians are going to suffer and Russian soldiers are going to die, because maybe he would think, when Vladimir Putin isn't around anymore, what do I want people to say about me? Legacy is a very powerful thing. And by the way, I encourage each one of you, including the young students in the room, I'm so thrilled you're here, to think about that right now. It's not just a question of what they're going to say about you in history, whether you're going to be in a museum or in a statue. It's right now in every meeting you're in every interaction that you have. What am I going to be remembered for today? In how I showed up today in this interaction with my spouse, with my friends, in this classroom, in this meeting. What will I be remembered for? Because our legacy is not one thing we do. Most of us are not going to be remembered because of one thing we did. We're going to be remembered for an accumulation of impression that people had of us. And if you want to be a leader, you will always answer this question, yes. I always say to myself, there's only two kinds of people in the world. There are people who make the room better when they come in, and there are people who make the room better when they leave. And if you want to be a leader, a regenerative leader, make sure in every single way, every room you go into is a little better than it was before you came in. Now, the next thing I want to talk about after the legacy piece is, to have regenerative leadership, I believe we must have non-tribal leadership. Now, here's an interesting question for you. You can answer it in your own mind before I give you my answer. Why did human beings come to be the dominant species on Earth? Let's think about it for a moment. And things will come to your mind. Why did we become the most dominant species? Why are we here in this room instead of some other species? Why do we have the capacity to change the future of the Earth like no species, for good or bad, like no species? And I say for good or bad. You know, we could blow the whole thing up or destroy the planetary system, or we could one day build a weapon that could deflect an asteroid that might destroy the Earth, you know. And here's my answer. Most people think it's because we were smart and clever. I don't think so. I think it was because we were smart and clever and we cooperated like no other species besides the ants. You see, humans didn't have a lot going for us. Yeah, we were clever, our eyesight was pretty good, our hearing was average, our scent of smell was terrible. And those of you who have dogs know that. I love Mary Oliver, the poet, says, you dog lover, she said, I have no idea what my dog smells, but by how she smells, I know nothing of smell. It's a great line. But one of the beautiful things is we really became the dominant species because we cooperated with each other to hunt, to do things we had to do to survive. But there's one problem. We learned to cooperate in very small tribes, with very local problems. What another tribe did 100 miles away didn't really impact us. And in fact, in our hunting and gathering days, if we had a conflict, we just go find another place because the world wasn't that populated, you know. And so for the most part, we learned to cooperate in very small tribes. You might ask yourself, how far have we come? One of the last EWI events I remember was the board meeting in Washington, D.C. at the Willard Hotel, I think it was. And there was a gentleman from the UN there whose name, eludes me now, but he said something that I've never forgotten. He said, in the last 60 years, the commons of the earth have grown exponentially, meaning the things we share in common that influence our destiny. But the governance of the commons has hardly grown at all. Let me say that again because it's actually quite profound. The commons of the earth have grown exponentially in the last 60 years, but the governance of the commons hardly at all. Think about how we still manage things like the oceans, for example, how we manage climate, how we manage all kinds of things pretty much from a tribal perspective. I'm unsure. I know I love French pastry and I love, getting a good hummus, in Israel or Lebanon, but I think the jury is still out on whether nationalism has been good or bad for human history. I'm going to guess in the end it's going to wind up being a pretty bad thing. And our way of tribal thinking is in fact, very dangerous. And in a world of WMDs, we cannot afford to be tribal. And by the way, when I say WMDs, before you think I'm only talking about our traditional weapons of mass destruction, some of us may have driven here today in a weapon of mass destruction. An SUV 5 times the size we need to go to the grocery store, meant to, drive through the mountains of Colorado. I always get a kick when a mother or father says to me they bought this huge gas-guzzling, SUV in order to protect their children. When a much smaller car passed the same safety record, but maybe their children would be better off if they didn't do that. And the point I'm making is, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the tribal piece, but it's very important that we cannot think tribally. And I'll give you one simple example. Because I'm quite involved in the eco-sustainability movement, I think of, for example, the issue of climate change. Now, we in the industrialized world, our way of life was built on the back of carbon. We have to face the fact we created the problem that we're in. The lifestyle you and I live, primarily in the large industrialized nations, has created the problem we have now. But we cannot fix it now by ourselves, even if we wanted to. We need nations like India and China and much of the developing world to be sustainable. So at the UN conferences on climate, we made rather paltry financial commitments to help those countries go green and adapt to climate change. Promises, by the way, we have not kept. And yet think about it for a moment. Is it not in our self-interest, if we want a regenerative future, to do that and to do even more than we said we would? And people say, I live in Canada and the United States, so I like that because I'm a dual citizen. I can rant about 2 countries, which is kind of fun, and be proud of 2 countries too. And one of the things, in Canada, because we're such a small country, whenever climate change comes up, although there's large support for climate change legislation in Canada, people always say, well, it doesn't matter what Canada does. And of course, that's kind of true. But on the other hand, we can't solve climate change if Canada doesn't do its part, if America doesn't do its part, and we can't do it if we don't help the rest of the world in a non-tribal way do what they need to do. Now, my final point, and I believe it may be the most important one, and maybe the least popular. So maybe you should give your applause for me now. No, just kidding. I believe regenerative leaders must be self-reflective. They must be humble. And the nature of humility is to turn the camera around, to be willing to see yourself the way others may see you. And by the way, let's make that personal. That means in a marriage, in an intimate relationship, I might want to try to see myself the way my partner sees me. If I'm a leader, I want to see myself the way the people who report to me lead. But I believe it's bigger than that. Because one of the most dangerous things is when we don't have humility, when we don't have an openness to see the world the way others see it or see us. When that happens, we simply can't learn. And regeneration requires learning. And what that means is we have to, frankly, be careful about believing our own BS. The moment you think you're the greatest company, the greatest college, the greatest society, you're in trouble. Because it means you'll stop learning. Now, here's where I said I might not gain popularity points, but I'm going to go for it anyway. Let's think about us as a nation, just as an example. And I say this as a patriot, and I mean it that way. America routinely believes it is the greatest nation in the history of nations. What president doesn't earn brownie points when they make that statement? The greatest nation in the history of nations. Now, I don't really know if we are or aren't. I'm not here to say that. I think it's a pretty great nation, right? Is it the greatest nation in the history of nations? Well, you know, I think you could have some countries that might have a contest for it. I think it's actually, though, a stupid thing to say. Here's why. Because the moment you say it, it will keep you from the humility you need to learn. Let me give you a simple example. Why has America not solved the healthcare crisis? I believe it's because we routinely believe we have the greatest healthcare system in the world. And if you're really sick, it's true. But why has every other industrial nation like us solved the healthcare crisis where no one walks around worrying about whether they have healthcare or not, right? And I believe in part it's because we believed we had the greatest healthcare system in the world. How about our democracy? I love the Founding Fathers. For their time, they were incredibly prescient, ideas that have lasted the test of time. They were brilliant people. I wonder if they themselves would sometimes wonder at our revering of them, our belief that the form of government they formed was so perfect that it doesn't need to change. I think about, that they created a system primarily to keep tyranny from happening. If you really think about the U.S. form of government, it mostly was to keep tyranny from happening. Let's make sure bad shit doesn't happen, that central governments don't take over and individual liberties don't get crushed. And it still works for the most part to do that. And it also has created a system that hardly works anymore to solve big problems. And I'm not smart enough to know how to fix it. I'm not even saying the Founding Fathers are wrong. But Jefferson himself said, about every 20 years, you've got to have another revolution. And I don't think he meant another physical revolution. I think he meant every 20 or 25 years or so, you better rethink the democracy. You better rethink whether what we're doing is working. And that's what regenerative leaders have to do. We have to even be willing to rethink our most sacred principles. And that's a challenge to do that. That's a challenge to do that. And I give you one last little zinger. It's a zinger for me in many ways. Like, we think of ourselves as a peaceful nation. I think about a fascinating conversation Jimmy Carter had in 2018. Some of you know about this with then President Donald Trump. And it's kind of hard to imagine, right? Because Trump, considered Carter the most failed president, maybe in American history. But Carter sent him a note about China, giving him some advice. And, graciously, Donald Trump called up Jimmy Carter to thank him for the kind note. I want to thank you for the kind note. I really appreciate it. And while I have you on the phone, I'm really worried about China. Seems like they're getting ahead of where he's going to be the Chinese century, et cetera. And Jimmy Carter told Donald Trump, it was kind of rhetorical, Jimmy Carter's a Sunday school teacher, so it's not a surprise. He said, so, President Trump, how many times do you think China has been at war since I left office? Donald didn't know. He said, 0. He said, how many years has America been at peace in this 242-year history? And Carter answered his question, 16. I said, can't be true. So I looked it up. He was right. But here's what Jimmy Carter said that's interesting. He said, I don't think that's because we're a warlike people. He said, it's because of our tendency to feel we want to foist our way of thinking on the rest of the world. Study sometime some interesting work by some scholars about how the West helped create Putin. Now, Putin, by the way, is 100% responsible for what he's doing right now. No one else. No one is responsible for what Putin is doing. But we helped create Putin by trying to foist our view on the rest of the world. Many Cold War scholars warned as we expanded NATO that it was a dangerous thing. Many people warned that, that our relationship with Russia post the Cold War helped Russians want the kind of leader Putin wound up being. Again, it's all on Putin. And here's my only point. It's not an anti-American point, but we live in America. So we can't be regenerative leaders for anyone else, right? If you live in another country, go ask the question there. What challenges must your nation ask? What assumptions do we have? How must we be humble to learn? Now, before I open up for some questions, I want to end on 2 notes of optimism. Some of you may have been fans of Carl Sagan. A lot of people criticize him because he was a popular astronomer, so like all popular thinkers, maybe a little loose sometimes with things, but he had a level of popularity no astronomer, maybe Stephen Hawking have, in a lifetime. And I love what Carl Sagan was asked before he died, which was 26 years ago now. Was he an optimist about the future of human evolution? And he gave what I think is a very powerful answer. He said, if you could project me out 50 years, 24 years from now, about halfway through, if you could project me out 50 years and we had neither blown ourselves up or destroyed the environment beyond repair, I'm very optimistic about the future of human evolution. He said, because all the trends are in the right direction. He said, but human beings are in our adolescence. He said, we're at that time in life where we have all the power in the world, but not the wisdom yet to know how to use it. So we don't know yet whether we're going to die in a car wreck or become a beautiful adult. And I don't know if Sagan was right. 50 years may have been short. But I do think that the trends are in the right direction. I meet young entrepreneurs all over the world in the business world who from the very beginning want their business to as much good as it makes profit. I meet leaders all the time in the business community who now are thinking cross-generationally about the impact of their companies on every stakeholder they're a part of. I meet people all over the world who are trying to reimagine our economic systems, our political systems, who are floating all kinds of dangerous and beautiful ideas. So I think Carl Sagan was right. But we're in this dangerous window. And now we need regenerative leadership. In our political leaders, in our business leaders, in each of us in every room we're in. And that means we're thinking cross-generationally. We're thinking about our legacy. We're thinking about the system. We're thinking non-tribally. And we're willing to challenge ourselves, even our most cherished beliefs. 2 years ago, I had the privilege of being on the program with Romeo Dallaire. Many of you know Romeo Dallaire. We probably think of Nick Nolte in Hotel Rwanda. Well, that was Romeo Dallaire, who led the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda during that terrible time. In Canada, as you can imagine, he is a national treasure, a national hero. I was on the program with him, and at the end of his comments, someone asked him a question. How long do you think it will be before we are not at war with each other? And I loved his answer. He said, well, I don't know, of course. He said, but I see hopeful things, always tentative, like Cyprus, always on the edge, but just holding on. He said, maybe it will take 200 or 300 years. He said, but we have to think that way and do what we can now. So in 200 years, it won't happen anymore. Anyway, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you. So open for questions, comments. Would love to have some. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, they get a microphone for you.
Sorry, Catherine Marie Smith.
Hi, Catherine.
To what extent do you think, or have you thought, that a very strong parting of our historical path might occur with the increase in leadership of women versus men?
Yeah, thank you. It's almost like I wish I could have planted that question, so that's beautiful.
I have a T-shirt that says "The future is female."
Yeah.
At which point, my husband says,
No, I tell you,
But-
I said to him, well, first of all, what you may not know about me is 5 years ago now at the University of British Columbia, I co-founded an NGO called Blueprint, which is dedicated to reimagining masculinity and its impact on society. So I have some skin in that game. I agree with you, and we deliberately said reimagining masculinity rather than reimagining men, because it isn't exclusive to men, though it probably has a very a male genesis, right? Which is a way of thinking, a patriarchal, masculine way of being. And I said to my wife Janice when all this was going on, and we said that among the three of us who co-founded it, damn men. Just like if women were running this, I don't think we would be in this mess. And I do believe that. But I think more importantly, if the feminine energy, which is, I think, inherently more generative and cooperative, and a part of it is biological, and part of it is sociological, right? We haven't given deference to the feminine energy. And probably not to women enough in terms of leadership. And so, we could spend a whole day talking about that, but I agree with you. And, Jane Goodall says, it's true, in almost all of our species cousins, it's the adolescent young men that cause all the trouble, right? And so it's not unique to us. And but we have to do something about it, right? We have to do something about it. And that requires men and the masculine energy also to self-reflect and have that kind of humility. And at the same time, there are good things about men and the masculine energy. It's not about destroying the masculine. It's about reimagining, what it means to be human to me. Anyway, so thank you. I agree. I agree.
We have a couple of microphones here. There's one here, there's one on the other side. If you have a question, you may want to grab a microphone so that our remote audience could hear you. And I will use this one.
Thank you so much for your remarks. I hope people will not judge every man by the shortcomings of many men. And I think there's a tendency to go in that direction these days. Secondly, I hope so much of what you said, so powerful, so persuasive, I hope this institute will have a number of sessions where we can go one step farther. And we can have the discussion on particular issues. Yes, but how do we get the specifics? And finally, I wonder with a challenge within this school, whether it's British Columbia or anywhere else, of saying people cannot discuss issues with people they disagree with. And the current situation, almost everywhere, in families and everywhere else, we cannot discuss things. We expect the other side to have facts, but we don't use facts ourselves. And we will not discuss and understand, why do you think that? What is the basis? What do we agree on? And hopefully part of this institute will be looking what generally you do internationally is, where is the common interest? What is the common cause? How can we work together to build on things we agree on to move to the more difficult issues?
Yeah, thank you. And the panel this afternoon, which I'm moderating and a part of, we're going to be tackling that very question around how do we really, talk about our differences and create the capacity for that kind of divergent conversation. And I guess amen to everything you said, and thank you for your kind remarks. I was thinking about something, Karen, when you were talking about the house, and I'm sad I wasn't around in those days with you guys. I would have loved that. Is you talked about time, just being together, right? And what happens when you have time. And I was restudying recently the Camp David process with Carter, and the Egypt-Israel peace accord. And it's unimaginable now that they were locked together at Camp David for 13 days. Can you imagine today, three heads of state locked in a place together for 13 days? Now, they weren't talking together the whole time. A lot of it was people, behind the scenes talking. And Carter, they said, would go to meetings And he would take copious notes himself, just deeply listening to what each person was saying. And I think the reason I thought of that story is I think it takes time to get beyond the pointing fingers and I'm right. And then once you're done your posturing and your finger pointing, if we can then take the time to actually hear each other, we almost always begin to find common ground, right? And how do we create, we're in an instant society, in a tweet, right? I'm just going to throw a tweet back at you, right? And I don't even ever have to see you, right? I can spear you on the internet and never look you in the eye and know you're a real human being, right? So I think we do need to find space for that. Yeah, in the back there.
And also, if our students have any questions.
Yeah, please, would love it.
Thank you very much. Could you please comment on what role, if any, does faith have in regenerative leadership?
Well, of course, faith is a big word, right? I am a Presbyterian minister. That was my first career for 8 years until I got a kind of fire in the belly for the impact that business had on society. So I come from a strong faith tradition, and it has influenced me deeply. And faith comes in many forms, secular and sacred, right? And so, I think it's a tough question to answer. I can only say for me, it has had a profound impact. But in its broadest sense, if we think of spirituality as the asking of deep questions, what the meaning of life is, what is the nature of our relationship with all the rest of life, what is our relationship with each other, right? What is the most authentic relationship with the self? What is the meaning of mortality, right? All the questions of which all the faith traditions have, if you will, come to encounter for us. I think dealing with those questions is at the heart of regeneration, right? Meaning taking the spiritual journey. Now, whether you come to the same spiritual conclusions that I might come to me is irrelevant. I believe if you take that spiritual quest and ask those deep questions, you will wind up being a more regenerative leader than you were before. And having said that, I know a lot of leaders, certainly in business I've worked with, where their faith has had a significant impact on them being regenerative leaders. Yeah, go ahead. And then we have a student.
A question from a student?
And you're not speaking for all students. This is your question.
No, hi, I'm Candace, and I'm a student. This year I've had the opportunity to learn from a lot of leaders in the Shotland Scholars Program, and one key thread that I keep hearing is the importance of humility and this growth mindset of continually learning. But I will say, as a student, kind of going out into the workforce, it seems very counterintuitive at times. It seems like in order to get ahead, you don't necessarily need to adopt that mindset because it's always about who is achieving the most. So I'm wondering, for someone starting off their career who wants to be a regenerative leader, what are some ways that students and everyone else in the room can begin to cultivate humility in their lives and in their leadership style?
Yeah, so three things come to mind. My wife Janice says I always say three things before I know there's three things. This is probably that case. The first thing is be genuinely curious all your life from right now about any feedback you get, whether you initially agree with it or not. Be curious. When people give us feedback, most of us say thank you, but, which is now thank you, let me defend my ego, tell you why you're wrong. I suggest all your life, from right now, you replace that with these different words, thank you, tell me more. Even if they are 10% right and you're 90% wrong, you will learn more by exploring the 10%. How did I do in that meeting? Well, you were really good, but let me give you some thank you, tell me more. The second thing is don't be a know-it-all. I mentor some people younger in my own discipline. They say, what do you wish you had known sooner in your career? Hands down, don't be a know-it-all. Confucius said 3 paths to wisdom. First path is through meditation. You can meditate for hours and hours, and eventually the truth will come to you. The second is through experience. which he said is the toughest path to wisdom. He said the easiest path is imitation. And he didn't mean like imitating someone else's life. He meant learn from others. I wish I had not been such a know-it-all. Find people who are really good and learn from them. Watch what they do. Watch regenerative leaders. Get close to them. John and I didn't do a lot of work together, but he had a tremendous influence on my leadership just because I got close to him and I talked to him and I learned from him and I saw the way he showed up in rooms, right? And then, the third thing is, I think, just always be willing to, always be willing to be the person asking the powerful question no one else is asking. Howard Bahar, who was really Howard Schultz's right-hand man, when he got promoted to the senior team finally at Starbucks, he was always the rogue, the guy who would say what no one else was thinking, ask the challenging question, challenge the emperor. But when he got to be in the senior team, one of his colleagues, who was another right-hand person of Howard Schultz, said, Howard, now that you're here, you can't be a rogue anymore. You got to start dressing the part, looking the part, and stop jumping in. Wait to see where the wind is blowing, and then express your opinion so you don't ruffle any feathers. So Howard did that. 3 months later, Howard Schultz sat him down and said, Howard, what the hell happened to you? He said, I promoted you because you always challenged me. You always asked the tough questions. You were a major pain in the butt. He said, I'm beginning to think I made a mistake. Howard said he cut up every tie I had, and I went back to being Howard Bahar. So don't be afraid to be unpopular sometimes, but don't be unpopular by making powerful statements. Be popular by asking powerful questions, especially if it's against the flow of what others are thinking, because often that's where the gold is. Okay, we had a final question, maybe or two over here. Yeah. Okay. We'll try to sneak in. Okay, we'll try and sneak in. 2 questions, and I'll be quick in my answers.
Okay, thank you. I'm Vera Trojan, and my question is about technology. How do you think it's impacting, particularly the ability to connect, to think across groups, geographies, the information onslaught? Just if you could comment about the impact of technology.
Yeah, I guess Dickens comes to mind. It was the best of worlds and the worst of worlds, right? So it's the best of worlds because I think we can collaborate globally, instantaneously, have the power to see what people are thinking and bring people together like we never have before. I met a guy, in fact, John and I, we were at The Hague, we met a guy who was running for office he lost, unfortunately, in Buenos Aires, state of Buenos Aires. And it was called the Internet Party. And the idea was they were going to run the whole government through the Internet by having informed, almost town hall sessions, but really where they would engage the citizens, because he believed the citizens most of the time, like Harley Davidson, with the right information would make the wise decision. So I think technology has a lot of enablement. It also has enabled us to live in little echo chambers and access only information that aligns with what we now view, which is very dangerous, right? So it's a tale of both cities, and so much more we could say. Yeah, final question.
As a communications expert, could you comment on the state of journalism in our country, especially as it seems to support these divides that you outlined? Thank you.
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. So, I mean, I don't know that it's the journalist's fault. Maybe we get the kind of journalism that we kind of ask for in a way, right? But I think of here's one thing that, is very dangerous in journalism, right? Is in the guise of objectivity, we feel we must give equal voice to points that often don't really represent an equal point of view. So, for example, there might be one, rogue, non-board certified surgeon in Florida who says that COVID vaccines do X with almost no evidence. but they will often be seen on equal access in a piece of media. And it's true on climate change, you see it, all the time. But I think even more profoundly, I often say, my friend Jeff, who wrote The Purpose Revolution, he came to visit me. I live in Canada and the United States. So he visited me in Canada. We were watching the Business News Network there, which is like the CNBC of Canada. And he's watching our news for like a week. And he said, there's something different about your television here. I can't quite figure out what it is. And then finally, after a week, he said, I think I figured it out. They don't yell at each other. He said, they're actually trying to inform me. And I believe news, think about, I always say politics in America is covered the same way sports is. We never believe any politician has a real conviction. They're just trying to win the game. So I think news as entertainment is very dangerous because what's entertaining is often not constructive. Anyway, that's my thought. So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the next day together. So thank you.